Hello everyone, I am Mr. Disturbing, and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. I should have known better than to drive Grandfather Mountain Road alone on the anniversary. But grief makes you do stupid things, and I'd been making a lot of stupid decisions since Dad passed. Every October for 23 years, we'd taken the same trip together, up through the Blue Ridge, past the kudzu-strangled telephone poles and the abandoned tobacco barns that lean like broken prayers against the sky. We'd camp at the same spot in Pisgah National Forest, drink the same brand of terrible gas station coffee, and talk about everything except the fact that he was getting older and I was getting further away from home. This year I was doing it alone. The red clay dust coated my windshield as I wound through the hollers, past trailer homes with Confederate flags and hand-painted signs advertising fresh honey and Jesus saves. The late afternoon sun filtered through the canopy of dying leaves, blood orange and rust red, the colors of autumn in western North Carolina. My dad always said the mountains bled beautiful in October. I pulled into our usual campsite just as the whippoorwills started their evening chorus. The air tasted of wood smoke and decay, that particular Appalachian perfume of dying leaves and damp earth. I set up the tent mechanically, muscle memory from decades of these trips, and built a fire in the ring we'd used since I was 12. That's when I noticed the silence. The whippoorwills had stopped mid-song. Not gradually, the way birds usually quiet down, just stopped, like someone had flipped a switch. Even the cicadas went quiet. And anyone who's spent time in these mountains knows cicadas don't shut up for anything short of death. I looked up from the fire and felt something watching me from the tree line. You know that feeling, right? When the hair on your neck stands up and your hindbrain starts screaming run, even though you can't see anything wrong. It's an old feeling, older than civilization. Our ancestors knew it well. The fire crackled and popped, sending sparks up toward the darkening sky. I told myself it was just nerves, just missing Dad, just the mountains playing tricks on a city boy who'd forgotten how to listen to the woods. But I couldn't shake the sensation of eyes on me, patient and hungry. I tried to eat the sandwich I'd brought, but my stomach had turned sour. Instead, I sat by the fire and pulled out Dad's old journal, the one he'd kept of all our camping trips. His handwriting was careful and precise, recording weather patterns, wildlife sightings, the exact coordinates of every place we'd ever made camp. That's when I found the entry I'd never seen before. October 15th, 1987. Something wrong with the hollow tonight. Charlie keeps looking toward the ridge, hackles up. Animals gone quiet around sunset. Found tracks this morning, human-like but wrong proportions. Too long, too narrow, claws instead of nails. Asked old Pete Hawkins about it when we stopped for supplies. He got quiet, wouldn't meet my eyes. Just said some hollers are older than others, and something's been living in them since before we had names for what they were. My hands shook as I read. Dad had never mentioned this. Charlie was our old blue tick hound, been dead 15 years now. I flipped through more pages, finding scattered references to the Watcher in the Hollow, and stayed by the fire all night, didn't sleep. The last entry was from 2 years ago, our final trip together before he got too sick to travel. It knows I'm dying. I can feel it waiting, patient as stone. Tom doesn't see it, doesn't feel it watching. Maybe that's for the best. Some things die with their keepers. Some knowledge is meant to stay buried in these old hills. A branch snapped in the darkness beyond the firelight. I looked up, straining my eyes against the black wall of trees. The fire cast dancing shadows that seemed to move independently, reaching toward me with skeletal fingers. Another sound, deliberate footsteps circling the camp, always staying just outside the circle of light. The footsteps weren't right. Too slow, too measured, and they were coming from above, as if something was walking along the branches 30 feet off the ground. I grabbed Dad's old mag light and swept the beam across the tree line. Eyes reflected back at me, too high to be a deer, too wide set to be human. They blinked once, slowly, and disappeared. The footsteps stopped. For maybe 10 minutes I sat there with the flashlight in my shaking hands, jumping at every night sound. When nothing happened, I started to convince myself I was imagining things. Grief and exhaustion and too many horror movies as a kid. Then I smelled it. Wet earth and copper pennies, like standing water mixed with blood. The smell seemed to come from everywhere at once, thick and cloying. It reminded me of the time we found that dead deer in the creek, bloated and rotting. Except this was fresher somehow, hungrier. The fire dimmed, flames shrinking down to blue embers despite the dry wood I'd been feeding it. That's when I saw it clearly. At the edge of the firelight, where the shadows pooled deepest, something tall and impossibly thin stood watching me. It might have been human once, maybe centuries ago, but time and whatever darkness lived in these mountains had stretched it into something else. Its limbs were too long, joints bending in places they shouldn't, like a marionette with too many strings. Its face was the worst part. Almost human, but wrong in ways my brain couldn't process. The features kept shifting, never quite settling into one configuration, as if it couldn't remember exactly how a face was supposed to look. And if you've ever felt that quiet pressure watching you from a tree line, that primitive certainty that something predatory has noticed you, yeah, you'll know exactly what I mean. It didn't move toward me, didn't need to. I could feel its attention like physical weight, pressing down on my chest, making it hard to breathe. It was studying me the way an entomologist studies a pinned butterfly, with scientific curiosity and complete indifference to my terror. I don't know how long we stared at each other. Could have been minutes, could have been hours. Time felt thick and strange, like moving through honey. The fire continued to die despite the logs I'd stacked around it, and I realized with growing horror that the darkness was creeping closer. The thing tilted its head, too far, like an owl, and I heard something that might have been my name whispered in my father's voice. Tom. That broke the spell. I lunged for my backpack, grabbed my car keys and ran. Didn't pack up the camp, didn't put out the fire, didn't do any of the responsible things Dad had taught me. I just ran through the darkness toward my car, branches whipping at my face, roots trying to trip me with every step. Behind me, I heard laughter that sounded like wind through dead leaves. I made it to the car and gunned the engine, tires spinning in the dirt as I fled down the mountain road. In my rearview mirror, I could see something tall moving between the trees, keeping pace with my car effortlessly. It followed me for miles, always visible in my peripheral vision, until I hit the interstate and the sodium lights washed out the darkness. I never went back to that campsite. Never went camping again, actually. Some traditions die with the people who keep them safe. But sometimes on October nights when the wind is just right, I catch a whiff of wet earth and copper pennies. And I know that somewhere in those ancient hills, something patient and hungry is still waiting. Still watching. Still remembering the taste of my fear. This happened to me and my girlfriend in the summer of 2019. We were on a road trip from Ohio down to North Carolina, taking the scenic route through West Virginia because Sarah had this idea that interstate highways were killing the American spirit. I thought it was romantic at the time. We'd been driving for about 6 hours when the GPS led us onto Route 19, then onto smaller and smaller roads until we were winding through mountains I couldn't pronounce the names of. The air conditioning had been fighting a losing battle against the humid heat, and everything outside looked like it was drowning in green. Kudzu vines had swallowed entire hillsides, creating these massive, unnatural shapes that looked like sleeping giants. The first sign something was off came around 4 in the afternoon. We passed this old roadside shrine, not the kind you see after car accidents, but something much older. Stacked stones formed a rough circle around a dead oak tree, and hanging from the branches were these twisted root sculptures. They looked almost like people, arms raised up to the sky, mouths open in silent screams. Sarah wanted to stop and take pictures, but something about the way they swayed without any wind made my skin crawl. I kept driving. The road started climbing steeper, hugging the side of the mountain with nothing but a rusty guardrail between us and a drop that disappeared into fog. That's when I noticed the silence. If you've ever driven through West Virginia mountains, you know there's always sound. Birds, insects, the whisper of wind through trees. But here, even with our windows cracked, I could hear nothing but our engine. and the faint hum of our tires on cracked asphalt. My arms were covered in goosebumps despite the heat. We came around a bend and saw them. About a dozen people standing in a clearing beside the road, arranged in a perfect circle around what looked like a massive tree stump. They weren't moving, weren't talking, just standing there with their backs to us. All of them wore the same faded brown clothing that seemed to blend with the tree bark around them. Sarah grabbed my arm. "Stop the car!" I should have kept driving. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to floor it, but curiosity is a hell of a drug. I pulled over about 50 yards past the clearing and turned off the engine. The silence was complete now. No engine noise, no air conditioning, just this oppressive quiet that seemed to press against my eardrums. I could smell something through the vents. Damp earth, rotting leaves, and underneath it all, something sweet and cloying, like flowers left too long in a vase. That's when I noticed the tree stump wasn't a stump at all. It was a hole, a perfectly round opening in the ground, maybe 8 feet across, with smooth earthen walls that disappeared into blackness. The people, I could see now they were men and women of various ages, stood with their toes right at the edge, arms hanging loose at their sides. One of them turned around. I've never seen a face like that before or since. The features were human enough, eyes, nose, mouth, but something was fundamentally wrong with the proportions. The eyes were too large and set too far apart. The mouth was too small, like a child's mouth on an adult face, and the skin had this grayish pallor, like old bark. The person raised one arm and pointed directly at our car. Without any discussion or signal I could see, all 12 of them turned to face us. 12 identical faces with those same wrong proportions, 12 arms pointing in our direction. They started walking toward us, not fast, but with this deliberate, measured pace that never varied. I fumbled for the ignition, but my hands were shaking so badly I kept missing the key. Sarah was making these small whimpering sounds beside me, but I couldn't look away from those approaching figures. They moved like they were underwater, each step perfectly synchronized with the others. The engine finally caught and I threw the car into drive. In my rearview mirror, I watched the 12 figures stop at the edge of the road and stand there, still pointing, as we rounded the next bend. For the next hour, I drove like a man possessed, taking every turn and intersection that seemed to lead downhill, away from those mountains. Sarah didn't speak, and neither did I. The radio wouldn't pick up any stations, just static with occasional bursts of what sounded like whispered voices speaking in a language I'd never heard. We finally hit a main highway just as the sun was setting. The first gas station we found was like stepping back into the real world. Fluorescent lights, the smell of coffee and processed food, the blessed sound of normal human conversation. I filled up the tank while Sarah bought us both coffee and a bag of chips we didn't want but needed to feel normal again. It wasn't until we were back on the interstate that I found the thing in my jacket pocket. A small sculpture made of twisted roots, maybe 3 inches tall. It looked exactly like the ones we'd seen hanging from that dead oak tree. A human figure with arms raised, mouth open in a silent scream. I'd never seen it before, and I sure as hell hadn't put it there. I threw it out the window immediately, but for the next 200 miles I kept catching glimpses of brown-clothed figures standing in fields and tree lines, always at the very edge of my peripheral vision. Every time I turned to look directly, there was nothing there. We made it to North Carolina that night and never spoke about what we'd seen. Sarah and I broke up about a month later, not because of what happened. We just couldn't look at each other anymore without remembering those faces. I moved to Colorado the following year, got a job in Denver, tried to forget about twisted root people and holes in the ground that went deeper than they should. I thought I'd succeeded. But every once in a while, I'll wake up at 3 in the morning to the sound of rustling leaves outside my apartment window. There are no trees near my building, and Denver doesn't get the kind of humid air that makes leaves sound like whispered voices. When I work up the courage to look outside, there's never anything there, just empty streets and the distant glow of city lights. But sometimes, pressed against the glass, I find small handprints that weren't there when I went to bed, and they're always too small to be human. I'd been hiking the Appalachian Trail for 3 weeks when I decided to take a detour through the Cherokee National Forest. My marriage had ended 6 months prior, and I needed the solitude that only the mountains could provide. The main trail was getting crowded with spring hikers, so I followed an old ranger's suggestion about a backcountry loop that would reconnect with the AT after 40 miles through some of Tennessee's most remote wilderness. The first day off the beaten path felt like stepping back in time. Ancient hemlocks towered overhead, their branches so thick they filtered the afternoon sun into scattered coins of light. The air hung heavy with the scent of damp moss and wild rhododendron just beginning to bloom. My boots crunched through layers of decomposing leaves that hadn't been disturbed by human feet in months, maybe years. The only sounds were my own breathing and the distant call of a pileated woodpecker hammering against dead oak somewhere deeper in the hollow. I made camp that first night beside a creek that sang over smooth river stones, the water so clear I could see native brook trout darting between submerged logs. My tent sat in a small clearing surrounded by mountain laurel, and as darkness settled over the ridgeline, I felt that familiar peace that comes from being truly alone in wild places. The whippoorwills started their evening chorus just as the first stars appeared through the canopy, and somewhere far off I could hear the lonesome sound of someone picking a banjo on a distant porch. The second day brought me deeper into country that felt forgotten by the modern world. I passed the ruins of an old homestead, nothing left but a stone chimney and the skeletal remains of a root cellar. Wild grapevines had claimed what used to be a garden, and I found rusted mason jars scattered among the weeds. A little further up the ridge, I discovered an abandoned coal mine, its entrance sealed with rotting timber and warning signs so weathered I could barely make out the words. The whole area carried a weight of history, of lives lived and lost in these mountains long before interstate highways carved up the valleys below. If you've ever hiked alone under a blood-orange Appalachian moon, you know that silence isn't always peaceful. That second night, something changed. I'd set up camp in another small clearing, this one surrounded by towering white pines, whose tops disappeared into the darkness above. The moon was nearly full, casting everything in that strange silver light that makes familiar shapes look alien. I was settling into my sleeping bag when I heard it, a sound like someone walking through the underbrush about 50 yards from my tent. The footsteps were deliberate, heavy, but somehow wrong. They came in sets of 3, then stopped for long periods before starting again. I lay still, listening. Bears were common in these mountains, but this didn't sound like any bear I'd encountered. The rhythm was too regular, too purposeful. After 20 minutes, the sounds faded, and I convinced myself it was just another hiker taking a late-night walk to relieve himself. But sleep came fitfully, interrupted by dreams of shadowy figures moving between the trees. The third day's hike took me along a ridgeline trail that offered stunning views of the valley below. Fog clung to the hollows like smoke, and I could see layer after layer of blue-green mountains stretching to the horizon. But the beauty couldn't shake a growing uneasiness that had settled in my chest. Twice that morning I caught movement in my peripheral vision, something large shifting behind the trees, keeping pace with me but staying just out of sight. When I stopped to look directly, there was nothing there except the gentle sway of branches in the mountain breeze. Around midday, I found something that made my skin crawl. About 10 feet off the trail, someone had arranged a circle of stones around a small pile of bones. Not human bones, but the remains of several small animals. Squirrels, maybe a raccoon. The bones were clean, picked white, and they'd been carefully sorted by size. In the center of the circle sat a single black feather, too large to belong to any common mountain bird. The whole arrangement looked deliberate, ritualistic. I didn't linger to examine it closer. That afternoon, the trail descended into a deep hollow where the trees grew so thick that even at 3 o'clock, it felt like twilight. The air turned cold and damp, carrying strange scents, something sweet and cloying, like flowers left too long in a vase. My boots splashed through boggy sections where springs seeped from the hillside, and more than once I had to step over fallen logs that blocked the path. The silence here was absolute. No bird calls, no insect buzz, not even the rustle of small animals in the underbrush. I was checking my map when I heard my own voice calling from somewhere behind me. The sound froze my blood. It was my voice. No question about it, calling, "Hello, hello," in the exact tone I'd used that morning when I thought I'd heard another hiker on the trail. But I was alone, I'd been alone for 3 days. I stood perfectly still, map trembling in my hands, as my own voice called out again from deeper in the woods. This time it sounded closer, maybe 30 yards away, hidden among the massive trunks of old-growth poplar trees. The voice carried a note of confusion, as if whoever was making it was lost and seeking help. But it was my voice, my exact voice. My rational mind scrambled for explanations. An echo, though I hadn't spoken. Some kind of audio hallucination brought on by solitude and stress. But deep in my gut, I knew something fundamentally wrong was happening in these mountains. Something that had been watching me, learning from me, and now trying to lure me off the trail. I folded my map with shaking hands and started walking again. Faster now, my hiking poles clicking against rocks with a rhythm that sounded too loud in the unnatural quiet. Behind me, my own voice called out one more time, pleading now, the way someone might call for help if they were injured and alone. Every instinct screamed at me to turn around, to go help whoever was making those sounds. But I knew with absolute certainty that if I left the trail to investigate, I wouldn't come back. The hollow seemed to stretch on forever. Hours passed without any change in the terrain, just the same massive trees and the same oppressive silence. My GPS showed I was making progress, but it felt like walking on a treadmill, covering ground without actually getting anywhere. The temperature continued to drop despite the late afternoon hour, and my breath began to fog with each exhalation. As darkness approached, I realized I had no choice but to make camp in the hollow. The trail showed no signs of climbing out, and hiking at night in unfamiliar territory was asking for trouble. I found a small flat spot beside a massive oak and set up my tent with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. The tree was so large that 3 people holding hands couldn't have circled its trunk, and its bark was covered with strange markings, not carved by human hands, but gouged deep as if by enormous claws. I tried to eat dinner, but the food tasted like ash in my mouth. Every few minutes I heard sounds in the darkness beyond my small circle of flashlight beam. Branches snapping, the whisper of something large moving through the undergrowth, and once, terrifyingly, the sound of someone unzipping a tent, the exact metallic rasp of the zipper on my own tent, coming from somewhere in the trees. I turned off my flashlight and sat in complete darkness, listening. The sounds continued, circling my campsite at a distance I estimated to be about 20 feet. Whatever was out there was big enough to break branches as it moved, but it never made the random noises of a normal animal foraging. Instead, it moved with purpose, intelligence, stopping frequently as if to study me. Around midnight, it started mimicking other sounds. First, the chirp of my GPS unit, then the crinkle of my food packaging, the squeak of my camp chair. Each sound was perfect, but displaced, coming from the wrong direction and at the wrong time. It was as if something was cataloging every noise I made, practicing, learning to be me. The worst came near dawn. I'd finally managed to doze off when I was jolted awake by the sound of my own voice, inches from the tent wall, whispering my name. Not calling it out like before, but whispering it with an intimacy that made my flesh crawl. The voice circled the tent slowly, whispering my name over and over, sometimes in my normal tone, sometimes in voices that sounded like family members I hadn't heard from in years. My ex-wife's voice, my dead father's voice, all coming from the same presence just outside the thin nylon wall. I lay frozen in my sleeping bag, afraid to move, afraid to breathe too loudly. The whispers continued for what felt like hours, sometimes fading to barely audible, sometimes so close I expected to feel breath on my face through the tent fabric. When morning finally came and the whispers stopped, I packed my gear with trembling hands and got back on the trail without eating breakfast. The 4th day brought me out of the hollow and back onto normal ridgeline terrain, but the presence followed. I could feel it behind me, matching my pace, staying just out of sight. When I stopped for water, the forest would fall silent until I started walking again. When I paused to check my map, I could sense something watching from the shadows, patient and intelligent and utterly alien. Late that afternoon, I reached a section where the trail crossed a series of rocky outcroppings with clear views in all directions. I was relieved to be out of the trees, to have open sky above me and solid rock beneath my feet. But as I crossed the largest outcropping, I made the mistake of looking back. There, about 100 yards behind me on the trail I'd just traveled, stood a figure. From that distance, it looked human. Tall, wearing what appeared to be hiking gear, standing perfectly still in the center of the trail. But something about its proportions was wrong. The limbs were too long, the torso too narrow, and it stood with an absolute stillness that no living person could maintain, like a scarecrow or a mannequin posed by unseen hands. I watched it for several minutes, and it never moved. Not the slightest shift or sway, just that perfect, unnatural stillness. When I finally looked away to check my GPS, then looked back, it was gone. That night I camped on the rocky outcropping itself, afraid to return to the forest. I built no fire and ate cold food, not wanting to create any light that might draw attention. The stars above were brilliant in the clear mountain air, but they provided no comfort. I felt exposed on the bare rock, visible from all directions, but at least I could see what was coming. It came just after midnight. I was lying in my tent, staring up through the mesh roof at the Milky Way, when I heard footsteps on the rock outside. Slow, measured footsteps that clicked against the stone with each step. But the sound was wrong, too sharp, as if whatever was walking had claws instead of boots. The footsteps circled my tent 3 times, always maintaining the same distance, always moving at the same deliberate pace. On the 4th circuit, they stopped directly at the foot of my tent. I could hear breathing now, slow, deep breaths that seemed to go on forever, as if the thing had lungs far larger than any human. Then it spoke, and the words nearly stopped my heart. It used my father's voice, dead now for 5 years, and said the last words he'd spoken to me before his stroke. "Take care of yourself, son. These mountains don't forgive mistakes." I squeezed my eyes shut and pressed my hands over my ears, but the voice continued, cycling through conversations from my past, using the voices of people I'd loved and lost. It spoke for hours, sometimes pleading, sometimes commanding, sometimes just reciting mundane conversations with perfect accuracy. The thing outside my tent had somehow accessed not just my voice, but my memories, my entire history of human connection. When dawn finally broke, the voices stopped, and I heard the footsteps retreat across the rock outcropping. I waited until full daylight before emerging from my tent, and when I did, I found strange marks scratched into the stone around my campsite. Not symbols or letters, but deep gouges arranged in patterns that hurt to look at directly. I broke camp and hiked harder than I'd ever hiked in my life, covering 12 miles before noon. By evening, I reached the junction where the backcountry loop reconnected with the main Appalachian trail. I'd never been so happy to see other human beings. A family of section hikers cooking dinner at the designated campsite, their laughter and ordinary conversation like music after days of supernatural silence. I didn't tell them what I'd experienced. Who would believe such a story? Instead, I camped nearby and fell into the first peaceful sleep I'd had in days, surrounded by the normal sounds of people living their lives. But even now, months later, and hundreds of miles from those Tennessee mountains, I can't shake what happened in that hollow. I've researched the area, talked to old-timers who grew up in those mountains, and heard fragments of stories that make my blood run cold. Tales of things that live in the deepest parts of the forest, creatures that predate human settlement, beings that learn to mimic human voices to lure travelers off the mountain paths. The Cherokee had names for such things, according to one elderly woman I met at a folk festival in Asheville. She called them hollow walkers, spirits that had lost their own voices and now survived by stealing the voices of others. She said they were drawn to lonely people, people carrying grief or loss, because such emotions created an opening they could exploit. I think about that conversation often, especially when I'm alone at night and the silence stretches too long. Because sometimes, in the quiet moments before sleep, I hear whispers in the darkness, familiar voices calling my name, using words I've spoken, conversations I've had. And I wonder if that thing in the mountains took more than just my voice. I wonder if it took something of my soul, and if somewhere in the deep hollows of the Cherokee National Forest, it's still walking the trails with my face, using my voice to call out to other lonely hikers, leading them deeper into the darkness where human footsteps echo forever, but no human ever returns.